I'm excited to have a conversation with you all. What I thought would be helpful is if I went through just a quick overview of the Agency by Design project, which actually takes place in 2 different phases. And then made some links and connections for you, and then we could have an open discussion. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay, great. And Josh, you said that the book is coming out soon, and I will tell everyone on the line right now. Right after this call, I have to jump on a plane to Oakland to meet our teacher colleagues over there, and apparently there are 7 crates of the book on campus right now, but they haven't arrived at my office yet. So it could very well be that a man with a hand truck and lots of books comes through my door while we're on the line.
Oh, that's exciting. I ordered a perusal copy from the
Okay.
public.
Excellent.
So hopefully that'll show up soon, too.
So this is a bit of a historic moment. So I'll walk you through the Agency by Design project, but first start with Project Zero. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Project Zero and the Project Zero frameworks. It seems like Josh is, and it sounds like some other folks are. But just really quickly, Project Zero is an educational research center at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It was originally founded in 1967 by the philosopher Nelson Goodman to study the cognitive affordances of the arts, like the screen says. And back then, Goodman was given this opportunity to study what we would call arts education today. And he said, well, we really don't know anything about it, so we'll call it Project Zero. And the name has stuck over the years, and we know a little more than zero about the cognitive affordances of the arts. Now we say we're zeroing in on learning. But Project Zero work has increased in scope from arts learning to thinking and learning, teaching for understanding, visible thinking, global competence, digital life and learning, civic and moral education, creativity and innovation, and particularly some of the things that myself and my colleagues study, which is maker-centered learning and design thinking. So just really quickly, I'll just show you the Project Zero website for a second. So I work on 2 projects here. One of them is Agency by Design, which we'll talk about in just a second. The other one is called Creating Communities of Innovation. And as this project summary says, it's a collaboration with a series of 7 schools in the United Arab Emirates, really trying to understand how a networked approach to professional development can help support innovation throughout this network of schools and create tools that are more broadly applicable in the realm of innovation. So the other project I work for is the Agency by Design project, which is what we'll be talking about today. If I just get back to that presentation. Okay, so Agency by Design is a multi-year project. It was originally and continues to be funded by the Abundance Foundation, which is a family foundation out of the Bay Area of California. And the initial phase of work was exploring the promises, practices, and pedagogies of maker-centered learning. So really trying to understand what was behind this growing trend in education. So that was our first phase of work, which took place from 2012 through the end of 2015. And for this past year and into next year, we'll be studying our second phase of work, which is trying to understand documentation or understand and develop documentation and assessment strategies for maker-centered learning. We had gone to our funders at the end of last year and said, if this maker-centered learning thing is going to be more than a passing trend, then we have to figure out documentation and assessment strategies that gauge the real benefits of maker-centered learning. And they agreed, and we're excited about that, and we're currently engaged in that work. But I'll walk you through the first phase of work to begin. So we work within this conceptual landscape that considers a few different things. So there's this growing trend that we've been hearing about for well over a decade now called the maker movement, which comes out of the Bay Area, the current understanding of what that is. And then there's this whole maker culture that's sort of swept throughout the globe, where there's this interest in making things, returning to the use of one's hands, not being the consumers of things, but also being the creators of things. And then where that comes into education, which we call maker-centered learning. So we define the maker movement pretty broadly. We say it's a rising interest in sharing and learning from others while working with one's hands within interdisciplinary environments that combine a variety of tools and technologies. So our definition is intentionally broad and is focused on activities and engagement and not so much on particular types of disciplines. So it's not about making robots, it's not about coding, it's not about specific things, because we felt that if we were to focus on those things, we would naturally exclude other forms of making. So we're trying to have as exclusive a definition of making as possible. So in the last few years, we've been seeing the maker movement spread throughout education and popular culture. In this screen that you're looking at, you'll see in the popular press, we've started to hear about the value of making in some very popular magazines and other press outlets. Then we started to see books come out about the maker movement, and you see a few of them there. There's one, Zero to Maker. There's even a Maker Movement Manifesto. And then there's this book by Chris Anderson that was pretty popular and continues to be, called Makers, the New Industrial Revolution. So we started to see this emphasis, this trend, and you'll see it in that next column where there's a focus on 3D printing, but talking about one of the benefits or big benefits of maker-centered learning being bringing production back to the people and this emphasis on a new industrial revolution of some sort. And then that final column on the right shows us some scenes from Maker Faire, which is where young people and adults get together to show off the stuff that they've made. They call it the biggest show and tell on earth. So this is sort of the landscape that we're working within. And then we're starting to see, as this slide shows, entering into the educational sphere. So if you're not familiar with some of the people on the left, the woman in the top, that's super awesome, Sylvia. And if you look her up on YouTube, you'll see that she has millions of followers, and she makes these really short shows that are fun and engaging. They're about 3 to 7 minutes long, and she'll teach her viewers all sorts of things around making. And then the young man at the bottom, his name is Kane, and Kane has developed what he calls Kane's Arcade. There's a short documentary about him where his dad is a mechanic and he gets lots of boxes, and Kane just started to make arcade tools and instruments out of the empty boxes in his dad's shop. So he's known for his arcade, and there's even a small video about him, or documentary rather. So what is maker-centered learning? We have this really simple definition. It's incorporating the practices and the ethos of the maker movement into various educational settings. Again, very intentionally broad. And to emphasize that broadness, one of the ways that we define maker is we take a symptoms-based approach. So this comes from our founder here at Project Zero, Nelson Goodman, who developed what he called the symptoms of the aesthetic to describe the arts. And just like symptoms of a cold or the flu, there are many symptoms of the flu, but you don't need to have all those symptoms in order to have the flu. So we tried to take a similar approach to defining making. So some of the symptoms of maker include some cultural characteristics, and here we have the maker culture is disruptive, it's curious, forward-looking, and experimental. There are community-based characteristics, so maker communities are collaborative, they're distributed, they're creative. And then there's process-based characteristics. So some maker processes are iterative, they're naturally interdisciplinary and flexible. And then environmental characteristics. So maker environments are open, accessible, and often tool and media rich. So again, using some characteristics, or what we call symptoms of making, to define what is maker, and not saying it's about using Arduinos, or it's about Scratch, or it's about drones or something like that. So we don't want to restrict making to a discrete set of practices, but rather open up making so that everything from indeed working with Arduinos could fit into this, but so could crochet or African dance or artisanal pickle making. So really trying to take a broad approach to what is maker. So the guiding questions for our first phase of work were how to make educators and leaders in the field think about the benefits and outcomes of maker-centered learning. So when we really ask people to really find out what is worth learning here, what are the real benefits of this work, and the dominant narrative in the popular press would suggest to us the core outcomes of maker-centered learning have something to do with increasing students' proficiency in the STEM subjects and getting them interested in STEM careers. And while indeed we heard folks talk about that, we felt that there was a richer narrative here, and we wanted to go deeper and find out what that was. And I'll explain what that was when we get to it in just a few minutes. Another question we had were, what are some of the key characteristics of the educational environments and instructional designs under which maker-centered learning thrives. So when we went on site visits and spoke to folks who do this work, how do they really design for their core outcomes in the maker-centered classroom? And the last one's about interventions. So what kind of tools or interventions can we develop that support thoughtful reflection around maker-centered learning and the made dimension of our world? And Josh mentioned some of those earlier, which include the agency by design thinking routines. So this first phase of work engaged in a literature review. And at the time when we first started, we were mostly going off of the popular press because many of the books that we have on our bookshelves today about maker-centered learning didn't exist then. They were in process. We engaged in a series of interviews and site visits, so visiting a variety of different maker-centered learning environments. And we also engaged in a series of action research studies, mostly working with a cohort of teacher partners in Oakland, California. We've now expanded that to, include our folks in Oakland, California that we continue to work with, but we also work with a cohort of educators in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I said before, the popular press suggests that some of the core outcomes for maker-centered learning have to do with STEM subject outcomes. But when we asked people, we heard a different story. So indeed, people did mention the STEM subjects to some degree, but they were always peripheral to what they talked about is the real or the primary benefits of maker-centered learning. And a lot of what we heard was educators who taught maker-centered classes would say that they wanted their students to get a sense of, I can do that out of their work. So to see the stuff in their world and not say, oh, where can I go buy that next shiny thing? But instead have an understanding of how things are made and say, I can do that. So we translated that to mean agency. And we heard educators talk about this sense of agency as an outcome of maker-centered learning in two different ways. One of them was indeed about stuff making. So there was agency towards making the stuff or the things in one's world. But another outcome that was very agentic in nature was they were talking about community making. So having agency or feeling like an agent of change within one's community. So these were two pressing core outcomes that we heard folks talk about. Another core outcome that we heard educators talk about was character building. And we heard them discuss this in a couple of different ways. And of course, character building, as composed to stuff making and community making, is a form of self-making. And we can almost think of agency and character on a spectrum. We have character on one end, on agency on the other. So developing a sense of self to be agentic or to have agency within the world. So we heard this discussed in these three ways, which are sort of linear. So self-making in terms of developing competence around a particular maker activity, then developing confidence in yourself as a maker, and then developing an identity as a maker. So we saw this as a form of self-making or character building. And then we heard a lot of general thinking dispositions discussed. And these would be what many folks would understand as 21st century skills, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, grit, resilience, those sorts of things. It was sort of like a kitchen sink of the buzzwords around 21st century skills that we hear today. But I think the interesting piece is really around agency and then this whole idea of self-making through competence, confidence, and identity. So this is what we identified as the real benefits of maker-centered learning. And then I mentioned that bit about where and how does maker-centered learning thrive. So what does the maker-centered learning classroom look like, or what does learning look like in the maker-centered classroom? And we heard really clearly that maker-centered learning is a process of distributed teaching and learning, which we found really interesting. So there was focus on individual students, but individual students were always situated within broad networks, and students themselves were seen as educators or contributors to the learning that took place in the maker-centered classroom. So within this area, we heard people talk about various roles and identities for teachers and learners. And this is all described in detail in the book that Josh mentioned, which I'll get to towards the end of this discussion. We also heard of redirecting authority. So instead of looking at the teacher as the authority in the room, to kind of turn that authority back on the students, or to direct that authority outside of the maker-centered classroom. So all of the knowledge and expertise that it might take to engage in a maker project isn't necessarily in the room. And part of being an educator in the Maker-Centered Classroom is helping young people information source the knowledge and expertise they need to engage in their work. And then this last bit here was all about knowledge sourcing and sharing. So I said a little bit about knowledge sourcing, but there's also this idea that comes from the maker movement that if you're not sharing, you're not doing it right. So something about teaching young people not to be proprietary about their ideas, but instead to put ideas out in the universe so that they can grow and expand as other people interact, hack at them, and remake them their own. We have two core concepts on the Agency by Design project, and these are really juicy pieces of the work that we've developed, and they've developed over time. The first one is this: it's looking at agency through the lens of making, which is what we call maker empowerment. Because we started to do a scholarly literature review on the concept of agency once that started to surface as a key concept. And we found that when you get into the literature on agency from the perspective of psychology or from phenomenology or feminist studies or any other kind of body of literature, the notion of what agency even is gets really muddy really fast. So we wanted to look at agency through the lens of making, and we came up with this definition, which is a sensitivity to the design dimension of objects and systems, along with the inclination and capacity to shape one's world through building, tinkering, redesigning, or hacking. So I want to spend just a minute or two more on this definition because it's a very particular type of definition, and it describes maker empowerment as a disposition. In particular, it describes it as a disposition from the Project Zero perspective. So at Project Zero, a disposition has three parts, and those are capacity, inclination, and sensitivity. So when we hear things like 21st century skills discussed, something like critical thinking is described as if it's a skill, okay? It's a capacity. But one can have a capacity or a skill, but not necessarily be inclined or know when to use it. So one of the analogies I make is a young person can have the skill or capacity to clean her bedroom, right? But she might not always be inclined to clean her bedroom. And she might even be motivated and have the skill to clean her bedroom, but not always be sensitive to the opportunity when it's time to clean her bedroom. So maker empowerment from the triadic theory of dispositions described like this has these three pieces to it: the capacity to engage in building, tinkering, and hacking, the inclination or desire to do that, but also the sensitivity to occasion, which we call sensitivity to design. And that's our other big concept, sensitivity to design. So this is learning to notice and engage with one's physical and conceptual environments by looking closely and reflecting on the design of objects and systems, exploring the complexity of design, and finding opportunity to make objects and systems more effective, more efficient, more ethical, or more beautiful. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what it really boils down to is seeing one's built environment as being designed and understanding that the designed world is malleable and that you can be an agent of change within that world, and that almost everything that we engage with has been designed by somebody else. And if it's been designed by somebody else, it could be hacked or redesigned by oneself as well. So in here, you'll notice we talk about objects and systems, and we've found that many folks within the domain of educational research considering maker-centered learning spend a lot of time talking about stuff, talking about objects. But we found from our work with both the people that we interviewed as well as the educators we've worked with is that not only are objects designed, but systems are designed as well. In fact, we can look at an object as a system. If you were in front of me right now, I'd probably pull off my glasses and say, you know, this is an object, but it's also a system. And it's composed of subsystems. And I might draw your attention to the hinges on my glasses and saying that's a subsystem of the greater system of the glasses themselves. But the glasses are also situated within even bigger systems. So a system of optical health, a system of fashion, a system of capitalism. So really thinking of objects as being systems themselves situated within other systems. So when you're making, you're really engaging in systems work. Now, we don't have to enter systems through objects. We can go directly there ourselves. And, you know, you might have young people look at their school lunch line as a system that was designed by somebody else. And maybe it's effective in some ways, but maybe, you know, the second graders get to line up for pizza first, and by the time the fourth graders get to it, it's all cold or something like that. So how can we redesign that system in some way? Now, it's a fun system to play with, but there are bigger systems in our lives that we participate in as well. So like here in the United States, a system of institutional racism is a system that we all participate in every day. And after that system has been designed by people, well, then perhaps we can have agency and participate in that system differently and affect change. So really, you know, quickly, this can blow up to be really big, and going from just looking at the stuff in our world to looking at the big systems that we engage with and seeing those as malleable. So the Maker Center learning framework that we've developed focuses on 3 capacities. So these capacities support having a sensitivity to design. And I'll go back really quick, and you could see that looking closely, exploring complexity, and finding opportunity are within that definition of sensitivity to design. So we draw those out here, and we see these as 3 interrelated capacities that help support both being sensitive to design, but also being maker empowered. So those are, like I just mentioned before, by looking closely at the objects and systems in our world, we can explore their complexity. And through exploring their complexity, we can then find opportunity to affect change. And I don't have them called up here right now, but as Josh mentioned, we've developed a suite of thinking routines that support these different capacities. So one of those is parts, purposes, complexities. So we could, again, look at my glasses, or maybe one of your glasses, or something that's on one of your desks right now, and just spend some time looking closely at it, considering what are its different parts, what are the purposes of those different parts, and how do those parts come together in a way that makes that object complex. We could do that for systems as well. We could bring people into the mix, and use another thinking routine that Josh mentioned, the think, feel, care thinking routine. So who are the different people involved in a system? What do those people think about their position in a system? What do they feel about that position? And what do they care about? What's at stake for them? So again, that's a big part of understanding other people's perspectives, building empathy, because when we engage in making, we inherently affect other people in the systems in which we're making within. So this is more or less the agency by design framework for maker-centered learning. And I'm gonna, from here, walk us into the second phase of the project really quickly. So as I mentioned before, in January of this year, we entered in our second phase of work, which is working with the same team and a lot of our same educator partners in Oakland, but now also working with educators in Pittsburgh. We're exploring 3 new questions. And the first is, how can learners make visible their ability to look closely, explore complexity, and find opportunity? So we're very specifically focusing on these capacities as a way into understanding both sensitivity to design and maker empowerment. So if you remember, we identified those as the real benefits of maker-centered learning. So many people be quick to develop pre and post STEM subject tests around maker-centered learning, but we found STEM subject skills and capacities to be peripheral to the real benefits of building agency and supporting character in maker-centered learning. So we're gonna focus on these capacities, looking closely, exploring complexity, and finding opportunity. Then how can teachers qualitatively measure students' performance within the realm of these 3 maker capacities? So how can young people make these capacities visible? How can teachers qualitatively gauge or measure those performances within those capacities? And then how can we collaborate with both students and teachers to design a suite of practical documentation and assessment tools best suited to the development of maker empowerment? And again, maker empowerment achieved through supporting a sensitivity to design through developing these 3 maker capacities. So those are the big questions at our current phase of work. And we don't have any big, we're developing tools around these questions right now, but we're in the midst of data collecting and tool development right now. So I could talk a little bit about some of what we're finding at the moment, but not quite to the degree that I can about the tools and the framework that we developed in the first phase of work. So really quickly, I'll give you a tour of the Agency by Design website, if this clicks in for me. And there we go. Okay, so this is the Agency by Design website. So as Josh mentioned not long ago, our book is coming out today, and no one with a hand truck has delivered a bunch of boxes yet, but I hope that they're on their way. So the book is called Maker-Centered Learning, Empowering Young People to Shape Their World by myself and my colleagues here at Project Zero. And it's a guide for implementing maker-centered teaching and learning that's available just today, hopefully. So in addition to that, we have an online course that supports this work, and that's called Thinking and Learning in the Maker-Centered Classroom. And this is offered by myself and my colleague, Jennifer Ryan. And this is teams of people from around the world who are taking this course, walking through the Agency by Design framework and testing it out in their home teaching and learning environments.
And we're sorry to interrupt, but we can't see the website. I think you may have just shared like maybe just a slide, so we can't see the website right now.
Hold on, let me try to make that happen for you. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine.
I know what happened, I think. Okay. All right. How about now?
Great, we can see it now.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Tried to do some fancy footwork and switch between PowerPoint and my web browser, and it didn't like it. So I'll just go through this again. There's the book link. So Maker-Centered Learning, Empowering Young People to Shape Their Worlds. And I was just talking about our online course, Thinking and Learning in the Maker-Centered Classroom. Teams of teachers from schools around the world participating in the course. We currently have teachers in the course during this run of the course from every continent but Antarctica. So it's an exciting place to hear perspectives on maker-centered learning from people all around the world, a really interesting cross-cultural conversation. And then we have an upcoming conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and this is run through the Project Zero Perspective series called Making, Innovating, and Learning. And there's gonna be a big focus on the Agency by Design project at that conference, but there'll also be a focus on the other project I work on, the Creating Communities of Innovation project. So those are a couple of big things. I'll just also show you on the website. So if you go to the Educator Resources page, you'll see our framework for Maker-Centered Learning is all here. So this is describing the three capacities. And if you click on one, they click through to further resources describing what they look like and offering some pictures of practice. We also have a fairly popular or fairly active blog that describes different activities that we're engaging with. So you can get an overview of the findings from the first project. You can read about our approach to assessment and documentation in the current project. And one of the stances that we're taking is taking a value-based approach to documentation and assessment. Read about our learning community in Pittsburgh, our learning community in Oakland, and new information is popping up on here all the time. We haven't been good about it lately, but when we review the literature in the field, we post everything on the website with not really a review, but kind of a synopsis of our take on some of the books that are shaping the conversation in the field. So let me just get out of here and take you back to PowerPoint quickly. Apologies. And all right, I think I lost the platform. So I'll just wrap it up there. Can you see my screen or not?
We can't.
Okay, then I'm done. and thank you for hanging on. I'm sorry that was a little bit of breakneck speed, but I'm really be delighted to talk through and answer any questions or engage in conversation. Yeah, but excited to hear your thoughts.
So should we open the floor for questions? I think it's a few people have joined, but it's still a small enough group that we might be able to just kind of let people chime in with questions sort of in a free-for-all. And if it gets chaotic, we'll regulate a little.
Sounds good.
So if anyone has a question, you can, if you're muted, you can unmute yourself and ask that question, or we can unmute everyone possibly, Vienna.
Yep.
Hi, this is Eileen Owens from Pittsburgh, and I have a question. The online course, Thinking and Learning in the Maker-Centered Classroom, I know it's ongoing now. Is it open to any teacher in the future?
Edward's muted. There we go. Okay.
Sorry about that. So yes, well, hello Pittsburgh, and the course is indeed open to everyone. It's open to all teachers. We asked just two things, and one is that teachers sign up in groups of about 3 to 6, because the course is structured around. There's obviously a large online component, but at each session, teachers will meet up geographically in their locales. So we ask them to sign up in teams of at least 3 to 6. We also ask that teachers have access to students during the time that they're taking the course, because they'll be trying out the tools from the Agency by Design framework, both in their team meetings with their colleague educators, but also in their classrooms. And by doing that, they're developing what we call pictures of practice of incorporating the tools from the Maker-Centered Learning Framework into their classroom. So yes, open to everyone, ongoing, twice a year, once beginning in February, so running from February to May, and then in the fall, running from September to December, and indefinitely, as far as we understand.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is Billy Rondinelli, also from Pittsburgh. So I have a question. One of the questions is, we're really working on a Future Ready Libraries project, and one of the things that you said really hit home. You were talking about redirecting authority to students and or outside in helping to redirect their learning from outside the classroom as well, redirecting the authorities. And so have you done any major work with librarians, or as you're working on Future Ready Libraries?
So yes, we have several librarians within our cohort, both in Pittsburgh. I believe we're working with folks from the Millvale Public Library, as well as folks from other libraries in the Oakland Bay Area. And we've worked with folks from Detroit Public Library in the past before. The Hype Teen Center there is what that was called. And we don't have anything specifically around Future Ready Libraries, but we have seen maker educators in those spaces working with young people, usually on drop-in kind of basis, not necessarily in sequential visits, although some people are interested in doing that. If you could just hold on 1 second, I'm about to receive a very big package. Hello. Hello. Thank you. Yep. I'm kind of on a call. Just right out here, right in here, school. Okay. Yep. Oh, wait a second. She could take them. Yep. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm back.
My question was more not about an actual public library, but librarians and educators within the schools. So kind of making the library the hub of the maker learning and having the librarians be a significant part of that.
Yeah, so we don't have anything that's a specific example of that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. You're probably familiar with the idea that libraries are interested in making themselves not only places where knowledge is consumed, but places where knowledge and ideas are created. And that's sort of the impetus around bringing makerspaces into libraries and making libraries the hub of making within schools. So that certainly resonates with us. We don't have any specific tools around that. What we do is we have librarians who work in those environments adapt our tools to suit their environments. Is that helpful?
It is. Thank you very much, because we're actively working on that right now. So thank you very much.
Oh, you got it. And as you do that, if you're applying tools in your space, I'd love to hear of a picture of practice, or maybe even invite a guest blog post showing how you're putting that into work.
Well, if you're coming to Pittsburgh, we'd love to have you visit South Fayette. So I won't take that time now, but you're invited.
Okay, I'll be there in May, but maybe before that too. So thank you so much. Other questions?
Hi, Edward. This is Aubrey. I'm in the room with Vina. I'm the research director at Digital Promise. One of the things that this group of folks has sort of been interested in the past is ways to sort of, of course, measure the overall impact of, maker learning experiences. And you talked a little bit about changes that we see in student agency as well as character traits. So I would love to just hear a little bit more from you around how you have seen that being measured and what kind of results we have seen.
Sure. And that's work that's really in progress right now here at Project Zero. But the way that we talk about it is through the lens of documentation and assessment, and taking a very specific approach to documentation, which comes from our Visible Learners framework. So documentation consists of 4 steps. It's observing, recording, interpreting, and sharing. And we find that there's lots of observing and recording in many maker-centered classrooms, but there's not quite enough interpreting, and there is sharing, but we find the interpretation stage is one that people stumble over. And that could be the space where we're really getting a sense of what the learning looks like in those environments. But we don't just say, what are signs of learning? Because that feels like a very vague and ambiguous ask. Instead, we're really focusing on what does looking closely look like? What does exploring complexity look like? What does finding opportunity look like within these spaces when young people are engaged in making? And what does acts of agency look like? What do systems thinking look like in these environments? So by developing documentation of young people making in the maker-centered classroom, over time, we then develop narratives, or take a narrative-based approach to telling the story of student learning within maker-centered classrooms. So when we say measure or gauge, it's really about telling the story of student learning over time. And this builds on previous Project Zero work, which was also developed out of partnerships with educators in Pittsburgh around what we call arts. Well, the project was called Arts Propel, but the big outcome of it was what's called a process folio. So instead of a portfolio, which shows all finished outcomes of young people's work, but doesn't necessarily show the learning that happened along the way, how can we develop process folios of young people's work so we see works in progress along the way? And that's what we're trying to riff off of that when we're making our narrative-based tools for documentation and assessment. How's that sound, Aubrey?
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like, it's really a lot of sort of structured observation and interpretation of what you're seeing, which makes sense.
Yes, and it's very qualitative, and it's also very formative. So we have that's another stance that we have, is documentation and assessment should be formative by nature, and it should support further learning and teaching. So by documenting what your students do today, and then really sitting with it, interpreting it, should help you not only understand what your students learned today, but also what you can do tomorrow to better support their learning. And all the while, as you're sequentially documenting student learning, you're developing the story of that young person's engagement in your class.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Edward, this is Vina, and I have a question kind of in relation to your involvement with the district in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
I was wondering if a school district were interested in having researchers come and kind of evaluate their programs or kind of work in collaboration with them, what kind of advice would you give them in order to reach out to these researchers or research institutions?
Well, schools contact us quite regularly with an interest of collaborating with them, or even doing, as you said, assessments or evaluations. We work through funders who help us choose the schools, that we're going to work with, and we kind of focus on those schools. The Pittsburgh group is a bit different from the group in Oakland in the nature of how we came to work with them. So I'm just going to try to share the screen really quickly right now. So this is if you can see it, this is the About Us page on the Agency by Design website. And this shows us the schools that we're working with or have worked with in Oakland, the ones we're currently working with today. And then for our Pittsburgh friends, you can see the school districts and other places that we're working with there. So it's not all Pittsburgh public schools. In fact, the biggest leader in this drive is the Quaker Valley School District. So if folks in the specific Pittsburgh region were interested in getting involved, I could definitely put them in touch with our point person over there, who's growing the network of maker-centered educators with the support of the Remake Learning Council, which my Pittsburgh friends will know of. But for people outside of the Pittsburgh region, I invite you to be in touch and to see if we could set something up. But generally, we're committed to the set of schools that are on the screen at the moment, with the only place there might be some flexibility being in Pittsburgh. But then when we develop our resources or do our external facing work, that's absolutely open to everybody. And we really do encourage people to be in touch and to reach as many people as we can. So I hope that was helpful, Vina. Thank you for asking.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Other questions?
This is Pittsburgh. This is Pittsburgh once again. This is Eileen
Hello.
Owens.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi. I just have one more question.
Sure.
If a district like us were interested in, we're trying to remake the librarian's role, and we consider the new literacy for them to be human-centered design thinking, agency by design, and habits of mind, helping to embed these characteristics into their, into all areas.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, if we were looking for grants that could support that, that is something that you could work on with a school district?
Yeah, I apologize if I was a little bit cagey about Vina's last question, but essentially we tend to develop projects around funding that usually is involved with working with specific districts. So if it was the case that you found yourself, you were able to land a grant, Eileen, and you wanted to collaborate with us, we could develop an inquiry around that work with you. So that's how work happens at Project Zero. Is we either pursue our own funding and have a few sites in mind that we want to work with, or more often funders come to us and say, hey, we're interested in this project. Would you be interested in collaborating? There's a back and forth, and funders usually have an interest in working with a specific area. So in the case of Agency by Design, the Abundance Foundation, which is from the Bay Area, had a very concerted interest in working with Oakland teachers. So that's why the majority of this work has been done in Oakland. And then there was a similar interest that came out of Pittsburgh, but with a different funding scenario. So if you found resources, we'd be certainly be open to a conversation. But without big grants, there's also ways to collaborate too.
Okay, thank you.
You got it, Eileen.
So Edward, I know you have a plane to catch. Do we have any last questions before he runs off to catch his plane to Oakland? Great. And Edward, would you mind if we shared your email with the group afterwards in case they have any last minute questions?
Absolutely. No, I wouldn't mind. Yes. Please be in touch. I'm always happy to have a conversation and support the work that you folks are doing. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward, for taking the time to share with us what you're doing at Agency by Design and at Project Zero and all the projects that you're currently working on. We really appreciate it, and we wish you safe travels.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you all today.